Diversity in Media.
When we're looking at the media and figuring out how do we entice members of the community to actually have these courageous conversations about how do we support women who have intersectional oppressions, right? Who have issues where they're not seeing that they actually have a safe space they belong to. I think that the media does have a very incredibly important role. And the reason why that role is really important is because you cannot summarize us to simplicity of a recipe or a Ramadan prayer or something like that. You have to speak about us with real terms and issues that affect us and impact us. And if you do that, then you're going to see people will feel safe, right? They're going to say that, oh, he or she's got my back because we're talking about issues that are actually impacting us, and we don't have to sort of fit to say that, please like me, or like the sort of the code switching that we do in order to access mainstream services.
To gain a full understanding of how well represented women are in news, we need to examine women's interaction with all elements of news production and consumption. As developed and discussed by Luba Kasova in her reports titled The Missing Perspectives of Women in News for the International Women's Media Foundation, consumers of media have several touch points with the news. At every touch point, there's a gender equality indicator as well as notes about impact. Organizational resources are women's first touch point with the news and include staff, management, and ownership of the news outlet. It is often assumed that improvements in gender balance in the newsroom and management will result in a more balanced representation of women in news coverage. News gathering is the second touch point and is about the representation of women as experts, reporters, spokespeople, and more general news sources. When news gathering considers gender equality, news reporting is more likely to be gender sensitive and transformative. Touchpoint 3 is outputs, which are described in part as the content or news coverage that uses women as story protagonists, including as victims and survivors, as well as experts on a variety of topics, and considers how they are portrayed. Touchpoint 4 is news consumption, and how it captures information about how and where women consume news and at what levels. For instance, women consume less news than men, and they consume more of their news via social media platforms than do men. Touchpoint 5 outlines individual impacts of news media, including the relevance of, interest in, and awareness of news items in relation to gender inequality and gendered issues. When men are still more likely than women to be protagonists in news coverage about gender inequality, one can imagine how and why that might lead to women seeing the news coverage as irrelevant. It may also point to a lack of awareness on the part of the media outlet. The opinion former or influencer-based impacts is Touchpoint 6, which focuses on news coverage that leads to an increased awareness of gender issues and more awareness about gender equality. We know the media are a key opinion former or influencer group. Lastly, Touchpoint 7, decision-maker-based impacts, have the potential to lead to transformative societal changes. News coverage can encourage politicians to act on or advance gender equality issues. A cursory understanding of these 7 touchpoints that women have with the media and news coverage makes clear the many reasons why diversity in media is important. However, several studies and reports indicate that there is a serious lack of diversity in media.
When you're looking at who is telling the stories, it's pretty homogeneous, it's pretty white, it's pretty male dominated, and you don't see a lot of individuals with different names that individuals from marginalized communities could recognize. It's pretty much telling the story of us by someone else. And I think that it's time for us to have the opportunity to tell our own stories in our own ways, in our own terms.
We don't talk about white people being a race, right? When we think about it immediately, we go to, Black or Asian or Filipino, like any other sect, rather than thinking about this idea of white folks being a race. And that speaks to the dominant understanding of just how we naturally go through our programming, that somehow white is dominant. So that in itself is something that I think we have to examine when we show up in the media, when we're looking at this idea of perpetuating from this hierarchical positioning what we see. Most reporters that maybe will be standing in this are white male. And, they control this narrative from that space of just entitlement and privilege.
First of all, I think that when we look at who is representing us in the media, we don't see a lot of diversity there. When you take that diversity away, you take away the lens in which we view things and we view the stories. And so the stories come to us from a point of view that is reflective of the person who's writing it, not necessarily the impact that it might have on the diverse community that we have in Niagara.
How can many of the impacts be achieved if journalists and broadcasters are still predominantly cisgender, heterosexual white men? If men are not considering the news they are writing or talking about through a gender lens, how can gender equality be advanced? What are the impacts on women readers, viewers, and listeners when most stories are written or broadcast by men who bring a different view of the world to their work? When raised with some local media workers that journalism and broadcast news is predominantly white men, a few of them challenged that assertion. However, it is well documented to be the case. In the Missing Perspectives of Women in News report, we learn that although some progress has been made, men still make up the majority of journalists globally, and that women's underrepresentation in media is more evident in governance and decision-making roles, making news coverage decisively biased towards men's perspectives. As found in several studies and reports, women journalists tend to be found most often in lifestyle, celebrity, and health beats, while men are significantly overrepresented in politics, sport, and finance. In their book, Reckoning, journalists and professors of journalism, Candace Callison and Mary Lynn Young, discuss the findings of long-term statistical reports that tell us that newsrooms continue to be predominantly white, and that while there has been some progress on gender parity, editorial and executive positions remain largely white and male.
There tends to be, in newsrooms, at least the ones that I worked in, where beats are assigned, that women tend to have more lifestyle, education, sometimes court reporting, health for sure, these kinds of beats. But men tend to have more the hard news, political reporting. Women are thinking more about community and more about how does it impact more than, say, just a certain group of individuals, more the community at large when making decisions.
I had my dream job. I did. I went back to school late. I was in my 30s when I did a communications degree and then a journalism degree. I wanted to work at CBC Television News, and I got that job right after graduation and started and worked my way into this job where I produced and hosted two news shows a day and was also a national correspondent and lived and breathed work and loved it. Doing local news. I loved doing local news, loved it. But I worked noon to midnight every day and most weekends. And then along came a child, and it was not even going to be an option. There literally wasn't even daycare in the city that went after 6 p.m. My employer was super flexible, super great about finding me another role. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same.
Also suggesting there has been some progress on diversity in newsrooms and leadership positions is political science professor Erin Tolley, who, in her book Framed, cites various studies that indicate the following. Only 1/3 of newsroom editorial positions are held by women. National English language columnists are predominantly men at 75%. Journalists who have minority backgrounds make up only 3% of the newspaper, radio, and television sector. Visible minorities represent only 5.9% of editors and producers in newsrooms. Visible minorities represent only 3.6% of senior management roles in newsrooms. And a 2004 cross-Canada survey found that visible minorities and Indigenous people made up only 3.4% of news staff. In Taking Care, a report on mental health, well-being, and trauma among Canadian media workers, which was released in 2022 by the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma, we learned that 81% of survey respondents were white, and there is an ongoing diversity and inclusion problem in Canadian media. A newsroom diversity survey conducted in 2022 by the Canadian Association of Journalists indicates that newsrooms are mostly comprised of white people, at 75%, and that there are no Latin American, Middle Eastern, or mixed race staff in 90% of newsrooms. In terms of gender, these two reports tell us that the representation of transgender journalists is less than 1%, and that while among survey respondents, the majority of journalists in the newsroom are women, their presence is primarily in part-time and internship roles rather than full-time and leadership roles. When looking at the results of the 2022 Canadian Newsroom Diversity Survey, it is important to note the low response rate and that the national averages cited in the survey are being driven by a small number of large newsrooms. These large newsrooms tend to have greater racial diversity, but most Canadian newsrooms tend to be whiter than the audiences they serve.
When we talk about legacy media, so your biggies, right? Your CBCs, your CTVs, your Globe and Mails, your whatever. When we talk about legacy media, these big corporate organizations, I think they are still dominantly sort of top heavy with older, whiter men. I think now we know that that's not good enough for people reflecting back a community or a country, having different points of view, different life experiences to bring to the job. I think we know that's important. But how do we get there quickly? We can't answer that because we can't get there quickly. But it's happening.
There are a number of kind of things underway to get more diversity in the newsroom. That is something where there is a kind of a goal, and they have these internships to try to get more female voices in the news, in the newsroom, and people of color. And that's a push that's gone on, but generally, no, really, it's not something that there's a lot of, at least in the newsrooms that I've worked in.
Admittedly, it is difficult to know if increasing diversity in newsrooms and media leadership would change the representation of women and other equity-deserving groups in news coverage, because several studies found there is no sex of journalist difference in how news is covered, or that it makes little difference in the gender balance of news coverage. It has also been found that there is little difference in how news is covered by white journalists versus how it is covered by journalists who are racially marginalized. All of the cited sources imagine the lack of difference is due to the pervasiveness of the white male point of view and notions of objectivity. Where progress can be made is in adopting strategies that are inclusive rather than simply focused on diversity, and by rethinking what it means for news coverage and journalists to be objective.
You have to get outside your comfort zone. You have to make a conscious effort to seek diversity all the time.
As a person with a very visible disability, I find that we are still one of the most underrepresented groups. There's always this push to get people of color and people of different genders and sexual orientations included more, which is fantastic and great, and I don't want you to think otherwise, but I just feel like people with disabilities still get kind of left out and are still locked in the punchline, and we just don't get included. So whenever I have the chance to push for more inclusion, I want to do that, whether it's through an advisory committee for the company or through just the stories myself. In my sort of everyday writing, I do constantly look for ways that I can include people who aren't straight, white, cisgender people with completely able bodies. It's really important to me to make sure that you're kind of hitting more groups, not only because then you're spreading the story through a wider readership, but then you're making sure that, you're not doing representation in stories where it's about the representation, because that's sort of tokenism in a way. You're doing representation in a way that is more genuine. By talking to different kinds of restaurants and people who look different and act different and whatever, and talking to them about all issues, you're making sure that they don't just become sort of one-sided characters in the eyes of people who read that story. So that's something that's really important to me, is to make sure that all kinds of people are included all the time.
I think that journalists, when they're telling somebody else's story, need to be really careful about the power dynamic that's involved, and really careful about how they're telling the story and who's being centered in it. Because while there is certainly some value in, anti-Indigenous racism not being taken seriously until the white people say that it's a real problem, the better thing would be for then the white journalists to say anti-Indigenous racism is a big problem, and you need to listen to this journalist who has been talking about it. And media can do that as well. Instead of just saying the story, the Indigenous story about is this, it's this person is a really good blogger, had really good essay. You should read their article. We're going to contract with them to tell a story about this, and then have that voice elevated. Because really, white voices have been elevated for a really long time. And I am wary of giving them more grounds to elevate themselves by saying, well, at least we're here telling these stories. Now I'm back to the need to cede power. Maybe you need to cede some power, step back and say, you know what? I have this column space. I am going to turn it over to somebody who is better qualified to tell this story.
It's called networking, and you do it. And I think now the one thing that reporters have now that didn't really have at the turn of the millennia was the internet. It's very easy to find a lot of information now. So the amount of time that a reporter has to spend researching compared to 20 years ago is much shorter. I think there's got to be a willingness to do the work, to actually make the connections. Because the other thing is, once the connection is made, so let's use Natasha as an example. So I make the connection to Natasha, and we have a coffee. We just go for a coffee, 30-minute coffee, just somewhere in my day. We make this connection. Natasha knows a whole bunch of people behind her, but now I have her name, we have a connection. So when someone in the entire newsroom is looking for a story, I know Natasha, Natasha's your person. It's kind of like legwork for the team, if you will. If the team works at getting these connections, then you've built the relationships. And whether the reporter stays or there's a new reporter that comes in, the relationship has been made, the connection is there for the next person. So I think that this is not meant to disparage any reporters, but it's just got to be a willingness to do that legwork.
I don't have a choice but to exist in a world in which I'm uncomfortable. I'm a visible minority. I'm an Indigenous person. I have a different worldview. Every day I leave my house, I am interacting in your world. That forces me to actually relate, to learn, to grow, to be. That's not the situation in non-Indigenous communities. That difference, it actually has to be intentional. So I believe that if a reporter wants to be a good reporter, reporters have to spend time in communities other than their own. They have to spend time in social circles other than their own. They have to be prepared to walk in and go to where homeless people are and talk with them. You have to forcibly look for those situations that raise your own humanity. It increases your ability to write effectively, and it increases your ability to communicate accurately with the public.
If you're doing reporting which has that cultural context, to think about how it's going to play out. And with the notion of cultural competence is a checklist of behaviors. People from these countries behave in this way, type of thing. And if that's where the reporter is stuck and never moves beyond that, that's what will be reflected in the reporting. If you move to cultural humility, then it shifts completely, because it says that we are responsible for thinking about each person as the expert on their own lives, and that we have to be able to explain that expertise to others. And in doing that, we get more of the story. It also says that there's power relationships at work, and we have to understand those power relationships and those dynamics, which would then bring into a story about a newcomer woman. One of those power relationships is the immigration system and visas and how they're allocated and what happens if you go somewhere and report. It brings into question why do people not go to the police? Well, you need to address the question, the fact that the police are not seen as helpful for a number of people, and therefore that is not the route they're going to go. And so if you're thinking of this from a culturally humble perspective, you would be reflecting why that's not happening in a way that gives empathy to the story that you're talking about. You have to contextualize it. And I think that's the difficulty with we see more stories, but we don't get the depth of reporting that's necessary for people to understand why they're even seeing the story.
And when you get an Indigenous training, please, please, please apply it to other peoples of color or marginalized people. Because the lessons you learn about Indigenous people and how to be, that holds true across cultures. So it shouldn't be necessary to take an Indigenous training, a Black training, an LGBTQ training, and so on and so forth. Catch the principle and broadly apply it, and suddenly you're a better human being. Voila!
Key takeaways. While change is happening, it is arduously slow, and news media continues to be dominated by cisgender, heterosexual, non-disabled white men, especially in the most prominent news beats and in leadership roles. Ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are focused on equity and inclusion and not just diversity. Acknowledge bias in hiring, promotions, decision-making, and how stories are covered and by whom, and take action to address it. Ensure journalists from equity-deserving groups are reporting on a variety of issues and not only issues that appear to fit with how they identify. Integrate what are commonly thought of as diversity issues into all stories.